Here's Melissa Jarrett Grant, author of Playing the Whore, The Work of Sex Work.
Backpage was seized on a Friday. That's one fucked up, right? And it was also at a point in the month where people had put a lot of money on their accounts, their ads that month. It's that disappeared. And I remember people sharing the screenshot of the Department of Justice. This website has been sealed terribly, probably, super low res, been snapshotted and screen shared and whatever. It's the Department of Justice didn't even have a clean graphic to put up, is what I'm saying. It was shitty. It just looked shitty.
Katie Simon of the mutual aid organization Whose Corner Is It Anyway also vividly remembers Friday, April 6th, 2018. In fact, we all do.
I remember the day that Backpage was seized. I had just finished 3 calls in a row. I was feeling pretty good about myself because I was oh, yeah, I don't need to work for 1 or 2 days now. And somebody texted me in a panic and was with the screenshot. And I was this can't be real. And I remember...
Backpage.com was a website that hosted classified ads since 2004. It was used by all kinds of people in the sex trades. And on Friday, April 6, 2018, it was gone. In its place was an insignia from the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Department of Justice. And in red and black letters, the words, Backpage.com has been seized.
The feds considered the Backpage seizure a huge win in the fight against human trafficking. Whether you agree with that or not, they didn't need FOSTA-SESTA to do it.
During this period, any online discourse about sexuality was in ever more increasing danger of being lumped in with human trafficking.
Some platforms, like Craigslist and Tumblr, changed their terms of service preemptively out of an abundance of caution. Others, like MyRedbook and Rentboy, were shut down by law enforcement. Tech companies didn't want to be seen as colluding with traffickers and didn't want to stand up for sex workers.
Here's Danielle Blunt of Hacking Hustling on what she saw as a conspicuous silence from the tech industry when FOSTA-SESTA was just a bill.
FOSTA-SESTA was being passed. I was attending a lot of tech conferences at the time, and tech was just completely silent. I would go to panels on content moderation and just be completely shocked that no one was talking about FOSTA-SESTA and how it amends Section 230 of the Communication Decency Act. It's the content moderation bill that we hadn't seen something like it. And the fact that everyone in tech was so silent about it was really, really shocking to me. And I would kind of troll. I would ask questions at panels on content moderation, and all the panelists would skirt my questions. I think because none of them felt comfortable being well, I'm not pro-trafficking, so I can't answer this question. And I really think that language of trafficking led to the utter and complete silence in tech. And initially, it really was only sex workers that were the ones ringing the alarms. It was sex workers and internet freedom people who would understand this. And I think even the people who would understand how bad this bill would play out, even if they didn't give a fuck about sex workers, just for the internet, weren't saying anything because of the language around trafficking. And I think that was why it was able to be passed. I think it was 97-2. It was a bipartisan bill, almost unanimous. And I think that something I would really encourage people in tech to pay close attention to is how these bills that are bad for people, that are bad for the internet, get passed under these fear-mongering language that people feel like they can't talk about.
FOSTA-SESTA supporters like to point to the shuttering of Backpage as a sign of the new federal law's success. But Backpage was seized before FOSTA-SESTA became law. The 86 prostitution and finance-related charges against Backpage were already criminal offenses. But the effects of losing Backpage were just like the effects of losing other online resources. It made the sex trade less safe, not more safe.
The Department of Homeland Security didn't need FOSTA-SESTA in 2015 to raid Rentboy. They didn't need it in 2014 for MyRedbook. As a matter of fact, in 2023, FOSTA-SESTA has barely been officially used at all. But we'll come back to that.
FOSTA-SESTA has positioned online platforms as potential villains in the fight against human trafficking. But sex workers and trafficking survivors, some of whom may have overlapping experiences throughout their lives, knew that platforms were just a neutral communication resource. Punishing the platforms would not keep us safe.
Here's Zara Raven of Hacking Hustling.
I do not remember anyone being like, that website really harmed me. I don't know. It seems so ridiculous, honestly.
I'm Tina Horn.
And I'm Mickey Mott.
We're sex workers and media makers. In collaboration with the Hacking Hustling Collective, Mickey and I are here to present an oral history of a particular era of sex worker organizing. We're covering the 10-year period leading up to the introduction of FOSTA-SESTA, the passing of that bill into American federal law, and the aftermath of that passing.
All that and more is coming up on this 4-part podcast, Let Us Survive.
This is episode 3. We really hate to say we told you so.
The bill package known as FOSTA-SESTA passed the House of Representatives on February 27, 2018, and the Senate on March 21, 2018.
Kate Diadamo had been organizing with Survivors Against SESTA in New York City, frantically building more community resources online.
Remember at the end of episode 2 when Kate said, "You have to organize with hope, even if you're afraid of setting people up for a fail." Well, despite all of the grassroots campaigning by sex workers to speak out against the bill, FOSTA-SESTA still passed with major bipartisan support. Here's Kate.
I want to tell the story because I do think it's important, because when we think about success as exclusively whether the bill we push gets over the line or the bill that we hate doesn't, we are setting ourselves up for such heartbreak every time we do that.
Jared Trujillo, an associate professor of law at CUNY Law School, remembers the day the FOSTA-SESTA bill passed.
When SESTA-FOSTA passed, I remember my first conversation being with someone that I was dating at the time, who I'm no longer dating, who said, well, at least Congress can do something bipartisan. And I just remember being so upset by that and thinking, because, we'd spoken about SESTA-FOSTA, and I talked about how terrible it was and how this could, how could this be inevitable? And this person that, I was dating at the time, who's still a friend, generally had pretty decent politics. And it wasn't even necessarily about sex trafficking for them or labor trafficking more general. So that was I just remember that conversation so vividly because I was so upset by SESTA-FOSTA that it almost took me back that someone whose politics are pretty good. And this person is just indicative of, frankly, other conversations that I had, around that April that, just really, I guess, gave me a really clear view of, frankly, how much of a fight it would be to ensure that other SESTA-FOSTA-esque laws wouldn't pass, but also if there would ever be any hope of repealing a law like SESTA-FOSTA. And so what I remember from more of the activist community was rage, but also not knowing exactly what to do with that rage.
Jared's ex was not the only one who realized that the trick to passing bipartisan legislation amending CDA 230 was to do it under the guise of stopping trafficking or saving the children. Since FOSTA-SESTA, we've seen other bills introduced and passed with similar language to stoke a similar moral panic.
Chibundu Ogwatu of the harm reduction organization HIPS in D.C. had a similar experience with friends in academia.
And I remember, especially after it finally got introduced into law, I was on a phone call with one of these dudes. He was in social work, and he's like, oh, but it's an unintended consequence. I'm like, what the fuck are you talking about? We work with the same groups of people. And I know that we have been reading sex workers talk and predict, fucking doom prophets, full on Cassandra mode, telling us what would happen. And we're seeing all of that happen. I don't know how, that's when I got into this thought process of this concept of unintended consequences and this concept of good intent from powerful sources like the government. Just thinking about, how did that happen?
So why didn't anyone in Congress listen to the sex workers speaking out against FOSTA-SESTA?
Jared and many others believe that FOSTA-SESTA passed for the same reason that Backpage was seized the same year. No one wants to be perceived as being pro-human trafficking.
So I think the biggest way that SESTA FOSTA was a fuck up is that people just had this knee-jerk reaction to this is anti-trafficking, and anything that is anti-trafficking is a good thing. I don't really think people even knew what SESTA FOSTA was. I think there's probably several members of, and I'm sure there's people on the other side of this as well, but I'm sure there are several members of Congress that just thought this is anti-trafficking. Anti-trafficking is good. I want to be reelected and I'm anti-trafficking, so I'm going to sign on. And the collateral consequences, they're probably not all that bad.
Elizabeth Ricks, the legal director of the Trans Life Care Program at Chicago House, agrees that plenty of legislators probably thought they were doing something good.
I think the fear of association with this is really strong. Whether people are really believe that, the story is about the inflated stats, not that obviously trafficking happens, but like we all sort of know how inflated the stats are. Whether they're sort of invested in that space and are genuinely frightened, or whether they just like don't want that stink on them, I don't know, but it's a very effective tool. You don't want to be that person. I mean, I think that's probably why everybody except like Rand Paul and Ron Wyden voted for SESTA FOSTA, because I do not believe that every single legislator who voted yes genuinely thought like this is a great idea and did not understand the sex worker arguments and wasn't compelled by the folks who've experienced trafficking who testified like this is no good, like this is just going to cause more harm. I can't believe that no one who voted yes didn't hear that and think that makes sense. But nobody wants to be the person who is seen as sort of enabling what's perceived as sexual exploitation.
Here's Melissa again with another reason Congress people may have voted for FOSTA-SESTA.
And it might not even have taken that much because it was, after all, being sold as about the children. And that's the kind of thing that, like, if you give them that, that's like an easy way for a legislator to say they support something, even if people important to them oppose it. How dare you not want to protect the children, right?
Here's Im of the Adult Performer Advocacy Committee on what the United States could do differently if they actually wanted to fight human trafficking.
I'm thinking like one of the first anti-immigration laws, the China's Exclusion Act, was also in part of being like whorephobic because they didn't want Chinese women coming across. They just wanted the male labor force. So like there are fucking roots of being in this country of being so xenophobic and whorephobic at the same time. If the government actually gave a shit about ending trafficking, they would improve the quality of life in the US, that they would be a safe refuge and actual asylum to refugees. I get that's complicated when the US has a hand in destabilizing those governments that those people are fleeing from in the first place. So it's complicated, right? Because the US as a government, as this corporation, benefits so much from the disenfranchisement of people, not only locally, but globally, as it is a member of the global community. So if the US actually wanted to reduce trafficking, it would have to not be this cesspool that marginalizes entire communities intentionally to benefit from that, to benefit from the suffering, the institutionalized suffering of people. But I don't think it's actually very interested in that because it benefits from that. Because I would imagine that there would be less trafficking if people didn't face like housing insecurity or food insecurity or, being worried about their documented or undocumented status or what have you. This isn't just about like the sex industries and the conflation there. Like trafficking happens across all industries.
Once again, this is the problem with legislation like FOSTA-SESTA. It positions someone as the boogeyman while failing to address the systems that lead to violence and exploitation of children, of adults, of everyone of every gender, online and in person. And this is not an unintended consequence of the legislation. It's by design.
Here's Zara Raven again.
I mean, I think the state is doing what it always does. The state is weaponizing the pain and the trauma of survivors to abdicate its responsibility to keep people safe. I mean, I'm thinking about like even right now, the ongoing genocide in Palestine and U.S. support for Israel and the ways that Jewish trauma is used to justify violence against Palestinian people. I think that's the trend, right? That's what the state does. Instead of actually giving us the things that we need to be safe, it says, well, what if we find somebody to blame? That's not us. And I think that's exactly what happened with FOSTA-SESTA. It was, well, what about these websites though? And so the websites became the villains. That was sort of like, oh, if we take down these sites, then and then it's like, okay, but then what? What happens for survivors then? These websites are down. Okay, where are survivors in this? What did they get? How were they supported? Are they safe now? That's always my question. Like, where are they now? Rather than who did you take down? Who did you imprison? I'm really curious about the experiences of sex trafficking survivors because in my experience, and I think I tend not to describe my own personal experience as trafficking, although the state, for anyone who entered the sex industry under the age of 18, even if they didn't have a trafficker or a third-party exploiter, would say, well, that's a sex trafficking survivor. And so even if I leaned on that, and also like the vast majority of young people in the sex industry don't have a trafficker, 80%, according to at least one federally funded study, don't have a trafficker. So it's a lot of young people who are experiencing homelessness, who have been in the foster system and moving from home to home, seeking support, running away from abusive homes, being thrown out because of their queer or trans identities, seeking safety, running away from violence, and ending up in the sex industry because it's one of the best ways to access housing. And when you shut down these websites, it's like, okay, are they housed now? or what did they get? That's always my question.
Here's M again with some ideas on how to actually be an ally to sex workers.
Differentiating between sex working and sex trafficking and the different multiple practices of identity and marginalizations that inform turning to sex work and engaging in sex work as a means of like labor and survival, clarifying that exploitation exists in every industry, not just in the sex industries. There isn't going to be one unified way of supporting all sex workers. It's like, get really local. Like, what are the needs of your local sex working community? Because a community that's made up of like indoor workers that never really come into contact with law enforcement, their needs are going to be really different than folks who are more marginalized and have more risk of being racially profiled, gender profiled, right? As well as encountering law enforcement because they're on their beat, rather than oversimplifying, like, this is the one thing that you need to do to be an ally to sex workers. It's like, who are the sex workers in your area? Like, what are their needs? What are their needs? Like, I remember when I was working for APAC, like the need that really came through is like, we need more sex worker affirming mental health services. That is what the need is, right now in that snapshot of time, right? So really having the response to supporting sex workers being needs-driven, needs that are self-identified by that community is the way to go, rather than this like top-down savior sort of bullshit that really reinforces those tropes of sex workers, not really having agency or control or intellect, what have you. It's like, no, actually listen to the wisdoms of the sex workers and what they are needing so they can work more safely. So if they actually don't want to participate in sex work, that they actually have options that aren't so shitty that like sex work makes way more sense than this shitty option.
Here's Blunt on the effects of FOSTA-SESTA.
I think that there is no possible way that you can look at the aftermath of FOSTA-SESTA and say that it made people safer. People died as a result of this legislation. People lost access to resources. People lost access to their communities. We lost community members because of this legislation, and that certainly doesn't keep people safer. I think the things that keep people safer is decriminalization, is the ability to talk about your work, reducing stigma, increasing access to resources, healthcare, childcare, robust services that don't tell people what they can and can't do with their body. I mean, I think it's really simple. When people lose access to resources, their access to make money, they can lose access to their housing, they can lose access to childcare. It puts them in increasingly precarious situations where they might be making different decisions than if they had access to more resources. When OnlyFans announced that they were stopping processing adult payments, I made different choices in my labor in a pandemic as an immunocompromised sex worker than I would have if I was able to stably make money online. And I think that people overlook the fact that when people have more access to choices, they're able to make the choices that work for them, that support them, that keep them space, that get them the money that they need. Especially in a pandemic when people were more reliant on online work, reducing, shadow banning is an act of violence, reducing someone's visibility, deleting someone's account. All of those things directly influence someone's ability to make money. And when you need money, you're going to make different choices in order to get that money. If you need to feed your kids, you're going to make different choices than if your kids were already being fed.
Here's Jared reflecting on what sex workers were afraid of in the immediate aftermath of FOSTA-SESTA becoming law, losing the online platforms they used for marketing, for safety, and for creating content, and all of the cascading effects of that loss on their lives and livelihood.
So I think people's biggest fear was probably deplatforming. A lot of those fears did frankly come to fruition, but people really feared different places for people to, whether it be selling sex or really just even giving information for people. I think people were really afraid that those mediums and those websites would just disappear. I remember at the time, they didn't even really know exactly what the criminalization would look like because there's 50 different state attorneys general. And so they didn't even really know what criminalization would look like. So there was the fear of deplatforming, and there was also the fear of, well, I'm just a content provider, or, I'm just posting an ad. What does criminalization even look like for me? So I think that was a lot of people feared that. Again, also recognizing the shutting down of Backpage, the shutting down of Rent Boy before that. At the time, I was working primarily with kids involved in the child welfare system and the family regulation system. And I think there was a lot of fear there of but were these young people even going to be able to get information? Specifically, like trans kids. If you're a trans kid in a non-supportive environment, or you're a gay kid in a non-supportive environment, or whatever, are you still going to have access to all these websites to literally just find out information about what is your body doing? Why do I feel this way? am I really alone? There was just a lot of fear that people would lose a lot of these resources. People were really worried would they lose access to tools that they use to be able to screen clients and keep themselves safe. There was, a lot of fear, frankly, about sex worker organizing.
Here's Elizabeth on how the new precarity of the internet led some sex workers to innovate in the tech world, although that too felt like a constant uphill battle.
There was a lot of community conversation about building out different platforms and trying to explore having domains in other countries. I guess like safety planning in a way of if this happens, we need to have like a go bag, an electronic go bag of what to do. Also start getting comfortable sort of divesting from platforms that are familiar. So I saw, especially as like a very much not tech person, it was really interesting to hear these conversations happening and like learn from folks about what they were doing, particularly because I knew it would impact the communities I serve as an attorney, trying to kind of keep up with that. And I, did the phone calls and trying to talk with people about why they should pay attention to this who are in like other activist spaces or who are folks just in my networks who I know are particularly concerned with internet freedoms, that this could impact lots of other spaces. It's not just going to be verification sites or, review boards. Everyone was screaming like, this is going to trickle down. This is not just about advertising and screening, although that's super crucial, but it enabled an idea of like third-party liability for tech, and that scares folks. I mean, people were shutting down sites before FOSTA was even functional law.
Organizers knew what the dire results of mass deplatforming would be. You take away resources, you take away options. This is part of how criminalization and platform policing of marginalized communities contributes to cycles of poverty. Here's Elizabeth again.
After FOSTA passed and like everything started shutting down prematurely, I had a lot of clients who went back to doing outdoor work, who had been doing indoor work and experienced increased violence. We had some folks go missing, and in talking with their friends, we learned that what happened was they then were like, well, my rent is due. I guess I need to go back outside, and work outdoors. And I have clients who like needed legal services that needed to be in person and just like kept missing court dates because they had to take whatever work, like whenever work came, they had to take it because resources were low after it passed. And so they just couldn't live their lives because they were sort of, you have to wait around for money to show up. But if money shows up, that's the most important thing. So they weren't getting the help that they needed. And like folks were just really scared. Like legislators and just other people at organizations who are curious about this. Is a client I had who got caught in a bust and the cop touched her inappropriately. Just, they do to really prove the case, right? And I just kept saying like, no, like this is just, it's how she makes a living. That's it. Like she needs housing and food just like we do. And it like just couldn't click for the prosecutor that this is just like a person like anyone else who's doing a job, except you're making it a lot harder for this person to do their job. The touching and like all of the physical engagement that law enforcement does, I think that is what shocks people the most.
Here's Zara on the importance of resources.
The fight for decrim continues, and I think those shifting attitudes, to me, that's probably the most important part of those campaigns. The public advocacy to shift public attitudes, to address the stigma so that we can reduce violence against people who trade sex. I see that as crucial and ongoing work, and also a pathway for ensuring that people have more access to resources. Like decrim by 2019 was not the pie in the sky. It was access to housing for everybody. It was access to resources for everybody, because the people who are trading sex by circumstance or, because of their circumstances or because of like coercion or were in exploitative situations, it was because they didn't have other options, because they didn't have resources. So if we want people to be trading sex by choice, we need to make sure that everybody has access to resources.
The organization Survivors Against SESTA, along with other community members, documented scores of tech sites that shut down or drastically changed their terms of service in the wake of the passing of the FOSTA-SESTA bill.
Now, the thing you have to pay attention to here is this. The authors of FOSTA-SESTA said they needed to amend Section 230 in order to prevent human trafficking from happening on the internet. But again, they didn't use FOSTA-SESTA to prosecute Backpage, and Craigslist did not remove its adult gigs/misconnections section because someone slapped them with a civil lawsuit. They did it because they didn't want to deal with being potentially slapped with a suit or being potentially raided by the feds.
The ability of adults to communicate and express themselves about sexuality online was instantly chilled by the passing of the FOSTA-SESTA bill. It wasn't even a law yet when it started to have exactly the negative effects sex workers said it would.
Here's Jared.
The biggest issue, frankly, with SESTA FOSTA for so long was the chilling effect. The idea that people didn't really know how far the law would go. They didn't really know what state attorneys general might go after versus what they wouldn't. And so you saw several websites that just shut down, several websites that enabled people to be able to trade sex more safely, several places where people were able to screen clients.
On March 22nd, 2018, Craigslist shut down their personal section. To this day, a message still appears on that website.
Quote, U.S. Congress recently passed H.R. 1865, FOSTA, seeking to subject websites to criminal and civil liabilities when third parties, users, misuse online personals unlawfully. Any tool or service can be misused. We can't take such a risk without jeopardizing all of our other services. So we have regretfully taken Craigslist personals offline. Hopefully, we can bring them back someday. To the millions of spouses, partners, and couples who met through Craigslist, we wish you every happiness. End quote.
We are also very happy for all the folks who found each other through classified ads. But you can't help but notice Craigslist is not wishing any happiness to the sex workers who used their services for years.
When Lakeisha Harris of Chicago Volunteer Doulas found out that Craigslist adult section was no more, her reaction was deeply personal.
From what I understand and know to be true, because during my time as a sex worker, I have used Craigslist for advertisement. It's a way of vetting people, right? You can advertise. It was a way of safely advertising, and you can get a sense of like who the person was that you were possibly engaging with. You can kind of like have several interactions with them and be like, hey, just like send me your picture, send me this information. It's a way of tracking a little bit like who that was. So it's a way of vetting. Also, it's not street-based. So you get into a little bit more contention when you are a gender nonconforming or a trans person, especially if you're a Black person, of targeting by cops and sometimes community members when you are doing street-based sex works. That's what it is, So you're a little bit more open to the environment, right? And targeted for violence in that way. Thirdly, you don't have the security. When you're a gender nonconforming person, they ain't letting you in the clubs. It's not, cis heteronormativeness is in the clubs. That's what's in the clubs. You don't have the environment and the security that reigns supreme of what's in the clubs. And that is what I know to be true. The closer in proximity that you are to whiteness and skinniness and, you're going to get the money in the clubs. You're going to get access to the clubs first and foremost, and you'll get more safety. And as a queer person, cisgender, I had more access to the clubs than my gender nonconforming queer friends. And so what I was able to do was provide housing security and internet So when they were in Chicago or in New Orleans, I could at least allow them the safety and security to vet folks online, right?
Lakeisha's story is another reminder of the way queer and trans and Black liberation is connected to sex worker liberation. This is why FOSTA-SESTA is particularly devastating to people who are already marginalized. The online classified tools that FOSTA-SESTA decimated, those were tools used by people who couldn't get hired at clubs because of colorism, because of heteronormative expectations of what a worker would look like. As we heard from Marla Cruz in episode 2, the clubs can also be dangerous places, but the point is having options.
Here's Katie on the FOSTA-SESTA fallout in her community. With no Backpage and no Craigslist and no certainty how they would be punished for using their online safety tools, sex workers had fewer options.
But for those of us who did work online or have a side hustle online, it was devastating. I've written about this in several different places, but, I always use the example of two Who's Corner members who were living and escorting together before FOSTA-SESTA, before the Backpage seizure. They were not doing great, but they were, making enough to keep a motel roof over their heads. They had money to support their habits. They had money to support a car. And right after FOSTA-SESTA, right after the Backpage seizure, within 2 weeks, they were not able to keep up their motel room. So they were forced to return to their hometown to stay with some relatives. They were notorious to the police in this tiny town. So they were arrested within a day or two of being there. One of them went away for a long bid in jail. The other lost her car and had to go back to an abusive ex-boyfriend so that he could drive her to calls. So, within 2 weeks from, sustainability to being trafficked. And and that story is like a very blunt and clear illustration of it, but there were so many iterations of that story.
So many iterations of that story. People working to survive, struggling against precarity. Predatory clients and third-party managers who knew situations were becoming more desperate. Workers looking for clients on the street instead of vetting them over email and with community bad date boards.
Elizabeth worries that FOSTA-SESTA sets a new standard for digital platforms being restricted or shut down. The new law was just the latest example of the fear of sex being weaponized and how policing of sex can spread.
The framework for SESTA-FOSTA will be being applied elsewhere, which is take a thing that legislators, especially on the far right, although we know SESTA-FOSTA was strong bipartisan support, take something that they don't like or gives them the squicks or feels like it could impact people like not voting for Republicans. And then they find a fear to attach it to, like, the Chinese government spying on America or trafficking or, whatever. I think trafficking and quote unquote terrorism are the two sort of hot buttons that they play with. Create third-party liability for companies that don't want liability or to be labeled as enabling bad acts, and restrictions then pass. Like it's a recipe for how, like, what costume do we put on this thing that we don't like? And then we write a law where people are liable and they play ball with us. Like they don't keep pushing because they don't want to get fined or they don't want to be seen as engaging in something harmful. And I think it can be used for lots of things that lots of people want to engage in. Lots of people, I think, used Craigslist, like adult ads, just for hooking up. At least in the spaces that I occupy, a lot of people when all of that went down were still using Craigslist to find hookups or partnerships, like for romance, sex, whatever. And that, I think, was a little bit of this could impact more because all of it shut down. It wasn't just erotic services. But yeah, the recipe that they used for SESTA-FOSTA could be applied to lots of other things. again, like TikTok, which is a tool for sex working people, but also just it seemed, especially the younger folks I know, everybody loves TikTok. Where are you going to learn your dance craze? It's also, I think, not lost on Republicans that people who are just becoming of age to vote, like people, especially like 18 to 25, majority vote Democrat. And they use TikTok to talk about the issues, like, lobby for candidates and organize. And there's a lot happening on that app in America around democratic and progressive politics that gets people to the polls that maybe wouldn't have voted in the first place.
Over and over again, we heard from experts that the effects of FOSTA-SESTA were not actually a decrease in violence or a decrease in forced labor. For many people, FOSTA-SESTA increased the conditions that made them vulnerable to trafficking and exploitation. The FOSTA-SESTA fallout was also a massive chilling of free speech online and grief. Lots of grief. Here's M again.
I know personally for me, still to this day, I really struggle with taking up space on online spaces because there's this threat constantly of just like, well, you may be deplatformed, you may lose it all. Like I've lost like 2 accounts, had things taken down and what have you. I've lost contact with community members, and there's this sense of like, I know I have this felt sense of like reaching across this nebulous void to try to find my chosen family and only hoping that they do too, but it's so hard when you're both shadow banned. I feel like the last 5 years has been like swimming through a lot of grief, a lot of difficulty, a lot of trying to find my footing. Because when it comes to being like an adult performer, so much of us is online. Even though I know it is like my performer self, but in some ways, like a sense of self is like taking up a space. And what happens when you just get blipped away and disappeared? There's something so violating in being disappeared in a bunch of different ways. It's so difficult. It's so difficult. It definitely has like financial ramifications, absolutely, and that is also a part of like mental health.
On April 11th, 2018, FOSTA-SESTA was signed into law by then United States President Donald Trump. By then, the internet was already transformed, and so was sex worker organizing.
There was a lot of rage, tragedy, and fear going around. But Kate has some cautious silver linings to share, the reason every phone call matters. Before the vote on FOSTA-SESTA in Congress, Kate was talking to a contact in the House of Representatives who told her their office had already taken a stance on the bill. But then...
So in the organizing around FOSTA-SESTA, we convinced no one on the Senate side to change their vote. On the House side, we had a little bit more time, and so we did more. They were like, look, we got our marching orders. It is really hard. You are asking us to do something that is just not really an option, is to reverse our stance. Maybe an hour later, if that, the staffer called back and was like, I just double checked. Oddly enough, the head of the committee has said we do not have a recommendation. We have not taken a stance on this bill. And let me do what I can to get as many no votes as possible. And so that staffer personally emailed and called and walked to other offices to say, please vote no on this bill. It's coming down. I know it's going to be a difficult no vote. And so, there's 435 seats in the House. We got like 12 Democratic no's. But they were all going to be yeses until we had those conversations. And we had a staffer literally walking up and down to like having meetings on this bill at the last fucking second on a really hard vote. And I don't want to ever pretend like that's nothing or it wasn't important. I think it's incredibly important to understand the level of growth that we have had over the last couple years. And also I think it's really important to understand, I don't even want to call it a starting point because it's based on so much years and years and years of work. But like, yeah, this is the starting point for what this stuff looks like. It is a couple of people just like marching up and down that hallway because they understand and just begging people to do something difficult. And a couple people did. And I am sad that that gets erased when we talk about this because that is a fucking win.
Kate has also noticed that staffers in Congress who didn't even understand what sex work was are now realizing this is a group affected by these policies, a group that they should have been talking to.
After FOSTA-SESTA, and this is actually something that I am excited to get into, that shifted just the number of people that had heard about sex work and I think for the first time understood or were coming to understand that when we said, no, we're talking about the issues impacting sex workers, and that isn't the same as just trafficking. That's part of it. But there's a difference. I think it hit home for people who may have been hearing that. And it made everyone hear the term sex work and realize that this was an issue. This was a thing. And especially for the folks that worked on SESTA, there was a very significant realization that they had thought they had heard from everyone and that there were victims on one side and the tech industry on the other. And those were the two relevant conversations. And there was this like tiny little sex work conversation that might have been poking in, but no one really gave space to. And then I think especially with the amount of response, both publicly from sex workers, but also the level of media coverage and the way that it had been covered, I heard more and more that there was this feeling of not just with staffers, but with organizations too, who all of a sudden were like, we thought we'd heard all the things from the experts. And the only people who were not the only people who were not listened to, but we weren't listening to the people who were affected and we weren't listening to the people who were right about what happened. And I think that hit home after FOSTA-SESTA. It was just an epochal shift.
The organizing effort around FOSTA-SESTA changed that. Now, staffers know the term sex work. But we shouldn't have to be put in a situation to say, I told you so, in order to be taken seriously.
Just to play devil's advocate, we asked Kate if wins like this one she was describing make it all worth it in some way. Does that progress balance out the hardship?
I think that erases the fact that we were put into a circumstance where that was the outcome, and that was the only outcome available in terms of taking us seriously. I think that when someone says, well, it was worth it, that erases every opportunity that someone had to listen before then, and it erases the fact that we were unfunded, having meetings with Congress, making phone calls, yelling, building the Survivors Against SESTA website, and that at any point in time, that violence did not have to be true for people to take us seriously. Actually, the people who were working on SESTA could have said, you have a point, let's listen to you, or you're an affected stakeholder, let's listen to you. The tech companies could have been anything but horrific at any point in time. Someone could have invested in policy work and said, we need advocates, we need funding for a lobby day beforehand. If someone says, well, then it was worth it, it erases every opportunity for that to not have been the case. And so was it worth it? I don't fucking know. But you put us in a position to where that was the outcome. And we made the best of the outcome. And so us, and when I say us as a movement, that has all the asterisks of like movement. At any point in time, those circumstances could have been changed. And us being resilient is not an erasure of the acts of violence that have been committed.
Here's Red of Hacking Hustling.
That's how I think we see the real potential of like working class solidarity and organizing, because you go to those places that you know and you outfit them for that moment, right? So we saw them become explosively organized. We saw them, like, the efforts ramped up. We saw new ones formed because people were talking to each other who had never talked
to each other before, specifically because of the Survivors Against SESTA community calls and national and local organizing efforts. So people who had never spoken before, who were based in New York, who were new to organizing, were now on the phone with like Women with a Vision folks from the South talking about stuff. And these folks had been in struggle for decades. Now they're talking to people down in New Orleans. Now they're talking to people out in the Bay Area. Now they're talking to people in Philly. And everyone is talking to each other about what they're feeling, what they're afraid of, what they're doing. Okay, what are you doing? How could we adapt that for our locality? And we're learning from each other. We are talking to each other, and that's what real movement making is. And mutual aid it became such a bread and butter kind of like necessary thing to expand in that moment, because people were immediately out of work, or their work had plummeted because clients were freaked out too. And so we had to rethink how to labor in that moment, how to organize in that moment, how to share information in that moment.
In the wake of FOSTA-SESTA, the need to decriminalize sex work, to remove bad laws and prevent new ones from being passed, was more urgent than ever. Here's Im on why decriminalization means liberation.
So, as someone who is not white, is not cis, is not straight, I'm really sensitive to just how people's identities are criminalized. And even things I'm choosing. Like, yes, sure, I'm choosing to do a certain type of labor. But it goes even beyond that. Just people's identities that they can't not be are criminalized. So it's so interwoven with decriminalizing sex work, because for me, sex work has been a way of so many individuals resisting capitalism, actually finding work that is accommodating to their disabilities, to their neurodivergence, and also pathways to liberation, like financially and socially. I know for me personally, I would not have had the financial independence and community support to get out of a decades-long abusive relationship had it not been for sex work. Had I not had like a part of my life where I could be so autonomous and be able to have so much control and power, very explicitly negotiated, with the folks I'm working with, to find my own sense of autonomy to get out of that. So decriminalization would, again, disrupt this pipeline to incarcerating individuals, right? Particularly those deemed as undesirable by white supremacist standards. As well as like really reduce the chokehold shame has on Western society. Because shame is used as such a tool of power and coercion, and like preserving really, really outdated ideas, right, that serve a very, very small portion of the population.
In our next and final episode, we'll be discussing what has gone down in the 5 years of FOSTA-SESTA being law. What has it meant for sex worker organizing, for intersecting movements? We'll also take a closer look at another major political crisis, the catastrophic changes to reproductive rights in the United States. What can the reproductive justice movement learn from sex worker activism? And how can we build solidarity in order to all get free together?
That's what you can expect next time on Let Us Survive, an oral history project from Hacking Hustling Collective. To learn more about this project, other research by Hacking Hustling, and more about the past, present, future of sex worker organizing, please visit hackinghustling.org.
These interviews were conducted in 2023. Some facts and perspectives may have evolved since then.
This podcast was hosted, produced, written, recorded, and edited by Tina Horn and Mickey Mott.